Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're looking at a story that completely defined a nation. A house divided, the heart of the Civil War. Have you ever looked at a map and wondered exactly how those lines were drawn? Or how a place built on this really profound idea of freedom ended up in a conflict so brutal it nearly destroyed itself? Well, today we are stripping away the textbook dust and looking at the raw, beating heart of this era. So, why did neighbors turn into enemies? It's a massive, heavy question, right? How did a country that proudly called itself the land of the free become the site of a heartbreaking war where brothers literally fought brothers? To really grasp this, we need to understand the brilliant minds involved, but also the deeply embedded, fatal flaws of the time. And to understand that, we've got to start with the man from the shack. Picture this, a kid born in a tiny one-room shack out in the Kentucky wilderness. He's poor, he's mostly self-taught, just devouring every single book he can get his hands on. That boy, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. Now, long before he was president, he possessed this remarkably brilliant legal mind. Take the famous Almanac defense. In a murder trial, a witness confidently claimed he saw the crime happen clearly under a bright full moon. Lincoln didn't just argue back. He whipped out an almanac, proved there was only a dim half moon that night, and caught the murderer in a lie right there on the spot. That sharp, incredibly observant mind was exactly what a crumbling country was going to need. Section 1. A House Divided. Now, you know the Founding Fathers wrote those incredibly famous words, all men are created equal, but they left a massive, glaring contradiction. 4 million human beings left in chains. Thomas Jefferson actually tried to explicitly condemn slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but he ended up deleting it because he was terrified of losing the South's political support. They basically just kicked the can down the road, hoping this massive moral failure would somehow magically vanish on its own. But, as you can guess, it didn't disappear. Instead, the country split into two completely different, totally incompatible worlds. On one side, you've got the North, filled with humming machines, booming factories, and rapidly growing cities. On the flip side, you have the South. Their climate was perfect for massive plantations, and after the cotton gin was invented in 1793, the slave trade absolutely exploded. So you have one half of the country building an industrial future, and the other half building an entire empire on the backs of enslaved human beings. Politically, they tried to manage this divide just by doing math. In 1819, there was a perfect tie, 11 free states and 11 slave states. But then Missouri wanted to join, then Maine, later on Texas and California. Now, what's really interesting about this is that every single time a new state was added, it turned into this spiteful, bitter fight for power. It was literally like fighting over the TV remote in the living room, because whichever side got more states could essentially force their entire way of life on the other. They drew lines on maps, making deal after deal, declaring the problem solved forever. But spoiler alert, it wasn't. Section 2. The human cost. 4 million. We aren't just talking about abstract political concepts or lines on a map here. We are talking about 4 million individual lives, men, women, and children, stolen from their homes. Families who were forced to stand by and watch as their kids were auctioned off like furniture, never to be seen again. This was a daily, unimaginable nightmare of barbaric punishments and forced labor from sunrise to sunset. Make no mistake, this is the true heartbeat of the conflict. And that kind of profound cruelty couldn't just stay hidden forever. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book was an absolute cultural earthquake. It acted as a giant mirror held right up to the nation's face, forcing everyday people to look directly at the brutality of slavery. And, as you might guess, a whole lot of people did not like what they saw in that mirror. Section 3. The Point of No Return. Then we get to John Brown. He was a radical abolitionist who believed that words simply weren't cutting it anymore. So he attempted to spark a massive slave uprising by raiding a federal armory at Harper's Ferry. Now, the raid failed, and Brown was executed. But the psychological impact of this, it was massive. It absolutely terrified the South. They suddenly believed there were a million more John Browns up north just waiting to come for them. Right in the middle of this powder keg, Lincoln steps back into the spotlight.
In 1858, he delivers this incredibly famous quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Now, Lincoln didn't initially say he wanted to kill slavery instantly. He just wanted to stop it from spreading to new territories. But to the South, that sounded exactly like a death sentence for their entire economy and way of life.
What followed was a rapid-fire domino effect. Step 1, Lincoln wins the presidential election in 1860. The crazy part here, he wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. Step 2, the South says, "We're done." South Carolina officially leaves the Union. And step 3, 10 other states follow suit almost immediately. The House wasn't just divided anymore, it was actively tearing itself apart.
Even as the country completely fractured, Lincoln tried his hardest to be the bigger person. He pleaded in his inauguration, saying, "We are not enemies, but friends." It was a desperate, hopeful plea for peace. But honestly, the air was already way too thick with tension. Shortly after, on a morning in Charleston, Confederate forces fired the very first shot at Fort Sumter. That was it. The peace was officially dead.
Now, here is something truly wild. When the war started, a lot of people actually thought it would be a fun adventure. No, seriously. At the first major clash, the Battle of Bull Run, civilians literally drove out from Washington, D.C. with picnic baskets to sit on the hills and watch the fight. They honestly thought the whole thing would be over in a week. Instead, they were met with the incredibly sobering, horrifying reality of war and a Confederate general named Thomas Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let's just say the picnics ended immediately. The true horror had begun.
Section 4. A Battle of Giants. And this brilliantly illustrates the tactical chess match of the early war. It was really defined by this massive difference in leadership. On one side, you have George McClellan for the North. He thought he was the nation's absolute savior, but he was so overly cautious he would just stay put, terrified the enemy was bigger than they actually were. It was maddening to Lincoln. On the other side, Robert E. Lee for the South, a brilliant, highly aggressive commander who could read his enemies like an open book.
Lincoln is basically pulling his hair out. He desperately needed a fighter, and he finally found one in Ulysses S. Grant. People whispered all these rumors that Grant was a drunk, but Lincoln saw a man who was willing to literally drive his head through a brick wall just to secure a win. When Grant captured a fort and the Confederates asked for his terms, he famously replied, "Unconditional surrender." Lincoln absolutely loved that fire. He even joked that if whiskey made Grant fight like that, they should send him a few more barrels of it.
Section 5. Finding a Higher Purpose.
Behind the large-scale maps and all the troop movements, there is a deeply intimate tragedy. Right in the middle of this unprecedented national chaos, Lincoln's 11-year-old son, Willie, caught a fever and died. Just think about that for a second. Here is a man desperately trying to hold a dying, fractured country together, and he can't even save his own family. It was a crushing, unimaginable heartbreak. But it forced Lincoln to realize that simply saving the Union wasn't nearly enough anymore to justify all this incredible blood and grief. So, how did he channel that grief? In September 1862, at the Battle of Antietam, thousands of men fell in the dirt. To this very day, it remains the bloodiest single day in the country's history. But Lincoln used the momentum from that grim, bloody victory to completely change the trajectory of the country forever. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, officially declaring that, as of January, all slaves in the South were free. This brings us to a really foundational concept. With the Emancipation Proclamation, the entire nature of the war transformed. It wasn't just some political squabble over secession or borders anymore. It became a moral crusade. It was now a fight to wash the nation clean of its original sin of slavery. The war finally had a higher purpose, one actually worthy of the massive sacrifice. We look back and see the names of generals and the dates of famous battles, but you guys, it's really about the 4 million people who endured unimaginable horrors to be free, and a heartbroken president trying to save his country. This explainer isn't just about some conflict in the distant past. It's a stark reminder that freedom is never a given. It is something people actively fought, bled, and died for. So the question we really have to ask ourselves today is, are we doing enough to keep our own house standing? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.